And to generalize, or to stereotype even, a lot of the art projects were much more about creating a certain value aesthetic, creating an impact that was cultural, social, and certainly had a production value, and that might take as long as it takes, depending on who was collaborating and all kinds of other social issues. So there was a need to somehow retrofit some of the art projects into set milestones in anything that might look like a standard European or other funding body proposal and timeline. Though the engineers at our table mentioned that that's often a way of working for them as well. So basically, people saying from different disciplines, time is an issue, and the need to structure projects according to set timelines with set milestones is both helpful in that it brings results and also often misrepresents the work and forces both artists and technologists to misrepresent the work in the process as an ongoing issue. There was big discussion about whether artists, or at least some forms of artists and culture creative workers, sometimes can't be subject to commercial pressures, under what circumstances, whether there was a difference, etc. Talked a lot about funding, several different conversations throughout the day about the siloed funding systems, blocking any of fruitful collaboration, even within technology and science, even within one university, let alone between universities and between the art sector. So the micromanaging of finance, especially in the recession, impacting on all of our ability to collaborate, strategies to get around that. Then interdisciplinary issues. We had the suggestion that, this is from session 2 now, that we needed some kind of a cross-disciplinary glossary or lexicon of words, because we often use the same words in different disciplines and in different cultures and contexts to mean entirely different things, and that can set up mismatched expectations amongst groups from the start, especially if you're working by remote and regather to find that you've been creating different projects than you actually all thought you were going to, with the best will in the world. And maybe some visualization of some of those differences across disciplines as well. Discussion about team size and contracting issues and the linking of networks. A lot of talk in that session about trust, on the fact that it's not just about matchmaking according to keywords or what you're looking for in a project, but that actual collaborations usually have to do with human connectedness, a spark when you meet someone, a sense of trust, or the fact that you met them in a trusted environment like this one, where someone in this room probably invited you and therefore you're more willing to trust the other people. So that those kind of human connectedness elements of networking. I'm nearly done. We need a common understanding of delivery, etc. We just had one which we threw in, which was about IP laws in the UK and Europe as too restrictive, particularly for art technology collaboration projects, where you just can't share your ideas without losing them, and you need that space to develop ideas in a safe context first, as opposed to other models in the States and elsewhere. Then we talked a lot about measuring impact, and following on from Linda's discussions about impact, not only in funding applications and in our reports to funders, but also in terms of artistic reviews, that if you haven't had some kind of impact evaluation set by your own vocabulary and your own terms and aims within a project as it evolves, then it can be even more debilitating if a critic, whether it's a theatre critic or a reviewer of a project, comes in and evaluates against milestones which were perhaps not even yours to begin with. So some way to match up those. So impact defined by consensus, or the need for impact evaluation within projects. There were lots of fascinating stories about art and technology connections, some really good outcomes and some disappointing mismatches culturally and otherwise. And then again, in all three groups, it was mentioned that collaboration can be by chance, synchronicity and happenstance sometimes led to some of the most productive relationships, but they then linked up to networks in a more structured way. And finally, a lot of talk about the need for mentoring and follow-up longitudinal funding and structures to enable projects to grow, stop reinventing each other's wheels, visualize the networks between the networks, and take everything further faster.
Very important thing I picked up is the idea of failure, that we're not talking that much about failure, although failure is something very important, because from failure you learn. If you described how you fail, you can help others with that knowledge. Yeah, we talked about the rigidness of funding schemes, that funding schemes ask for collaboration, but if you become too much transdisciplinary, you're rejected because we had someone at this table, it was you, I think, you told us about how you applied for funding where there was an artist to be asked as the prime investigator, or the other way around. And just a few days before the deadline, you were rejected. More sort-like stories. We had a lot of discussion here on this table about what this transdisciplinarity means and how you get those sorts of knowledge together and where it again fails.
An interesting perspective that came out was the need to share an understanding of other disciplines' methodologies and the way that they think about things. So that it isn't just a question of a technology point of view, an artist's point of view, an artist's way of thinking, or a scientific way of thinking, but there are nuances that we need to be more aware of. And I think most people in the groups were implying that they really did need to know more about that. And that tied in with our interest in educating for collaboration. Educating for collaboration from school onwards. That's something that perhaps happens in some schools, in some cultures, but not in others. And then the question of whether we can learn to collaborate came up. Most people, certainly in one of the groups, felt that they could. It was a question of what was appropriate in given situations, so that there's no simple recipe for how to collaborate, although obviously we can learn from examples of what other people have done. And then the whole question of the degree of what a disciplinary is, and it's interesting, we asked the question about what disciplines were around the table, and there were everybody seemed to have 2 or 3 or 4 even disciplines that they could label themselves with. So it is a question of the degree of disciplinarity. What is the separation? In a group like this, it's probably reasonable to assume that there are few people here who have a single discipline and that's all they do. So there are educators and organisers and facilitators, artists, programmers, engineers. And those people, this is in the nature of the mix that's here, that there are many ways in which we can put different hats on ourselves, and perhaps that very fact means that we're already prepared to do that important thing of sharing an understanding of other disciplines, because of the nature of it. And we had some very nice examples of people's experiences, which I won't go into now. Lucas mentioned the whole question of failure. Well, in a sense, the failure, if you fail at something, then that suggests that you've perhaps been taking some risks. And perhaps the important thing is, does collaboration enable you to take more risks? Is that an opportunity to experiment more? But then that we also observed that in our culture, it's very hard to admit failure. Somehow this is certainly in front of our project officers, we don't like to do it, because that's just not, you don't get any points for that, do you? And yet, it's very important that failure should be acknowledged, because if you do fail at something, it means that you've been trying. You may have got it wrong, but at least you're going outside your comfort zone and working on something that is a little bit different. So, yes, and there were lots of things talking about the porous boundaries that exist between disciplines nowadays and how that should be encouraged. Even if we don't share all the skills that go with a particular discipline, that perhaps we're also living in an age when the nature of disciplines is changing, so that what we might now call an artist is a very different kind of creature to an artist 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago. And we need to bear that in mind. We also talked about spaces, environments for collaboration, physical environments, virtual environments, and how there was a need for fluidity, or at least flexibility, that to devise what is appropriate for a working environment was quite difficult. It's difficult to specify, and there needs to be some way of creating an infrastructure that allows for plug in and plug out technologies to be used. And that seemed to be also associated with some people's feeling that residencies at least should be in some way co-located, that people should actually reside in the same spaces for some of the time at any rate, and physical co-location rather than always doing things virtually.
For us, there were significant differences between the first group, which was mostly artists and other, and the second group, which was interdisciplinary. Interestingly, and I realize it depends on the artists at the table, there was absolutely no need or demands for spaces amongst the artists. They were all basically saying, I have my laptop, I work with software or hardware, so space was really not an issue. Funding definitely was a lot of need for more diversified funding for the breaking of these traditional categories. One example, one artist working with choreography saying, I would never get funding from the dance or that angle. I have to go through the art technology, who have no problems with the fact that dance or choreography might be involved. Also, the artist...
The first group was dominated by artists who described that in a collaborative space, the issues that they have to deal with is busy spaces. It's difficult to find a slot to fit in. Open spaces and environments that can be proved to be very destructive sometimes. Community centers without proper equipment to be used, and or outdated equipment in collaborative spaces. About the skills and expertise, they pinpointed the fact that experience and expertise sharing is important, and there must be a balance between the skills and the expertise in a team that needs to collaborate in order to achieve the aims of ICT and art project. In order to be a balance. Regarding funding, the issues that were identified, it was regarding that there is a need for multidisciplinary research, while some disciplines can attract easier funding than others. For example, there was a point that ICT can attract more funding than art, or easier funding than art. Regarding communication, the facts that were pinpointed was that sometimes people are reluctant to communicate and work in small pilot projects, while this can lead to bigger collaborations in the future. Ego is an inevitable issue. It's very difficult for an ICT person to accept the opinion of an artist, and the artist not to feel restrained by the ICT, by his ICT colleague. Another issue that was pinpointed is the credit issue. Who takes the credit from the outcomes of the project? And that small projects with short lifespan is not the best solution to promote communication. Regarding dissemination, it was identified that there are two aspects in each project. One is the artwork that is produced, and the other is the research report, the documentation. Poor dissemination can reduce the impact of a great artwork, and short-time collaborations do not promote high-quality dissemination and exploitation of the results. Regarding the multicultural collaboration, yes, the issues that were identified were the language barriers between a multicultural team, terminology... multidisciplinary, yes. Sorry. The terminology barriers, again, because some terms might be used in, have a different meaning in ICT, different meaning in art. But it was pinpointed that the origins of creation are common, and imagination is interdisciplinary ability, let's say, that promotes creation, and needs time and training in order to get used to the needs of the other person, the needs and the requirements of the ICT culture or the art culture. Regarding the 5 main points that they were identified that need to be changed in order to promote collaboration between the two cultures, ICT and art. The first was the time scaling of the projects. It was pinpointed that it is required a realistic time scaling for the project with more time, realistic funding, mutual respect between the experts, mentoring from people who are active in and worked in similar projects. And the last one was both sides to be open-minded, to be eager to listen to each other and communicate without fear, without being defensive or feeling threatened.
We spoke about spaces and environments a lot as well. I think the general consensus between everybody was that we need to basically design the environment smarter and make collaborative spaces where collaboration is nurtured, but actually design these spaces collaboratively too, so the process as well, whether it's virtual or physical. But we also discovered that alone time or solitary spaces are just as important, and these are all things that there has to be consensus in the collaborative group beforehand, when that comes into play. We also spoke a lot about the analog and the digital. So, for example, in this digital age, when we're so used to basically spell check and things like that, we actually end up outsourcing a lot of our brain activity to technology. So what we need to, maybe something that can be learned through collaboration is to use traditional tools as well as innovative ones, and actually that way utilize our brain to a fuller capacity. We spoke about communication tools.
Yeah, we were talking about telepresence and the idea of sort of upgrading Skype with holographic technology, which is coming. So effectively using haptic technology as well. So you're actually able to use all the senses in the collaboration, especially if everyone's happy to be just siloed off. I think we've already discussed the idea that we do need the site-specific. Again, we were talking about technologies like Google Glass and effectively how they are leading to things like the stealing of the gaze and how important the gaze is in collaboration in the site-specific experience. We talked about interesting technologies like the Oculus Rift that are allowing people to have out-of-body experiences. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow, but this idea on the impact on the concept of ownership of ideas and IPR, if we're able to leave our bodies behind and literally what effect that will have on group dynamics if we're not constantly concerned that I own that idea. So again, links up with this idea of hybrid methodologies and techniques, really like we've already discussed, combining the affordances of the physical and the digital, leading to new forms of knowledge production. What else? So, and also the social impact of the collaboration and having that at the forefront, because ultimately, if we're going to use technologies like Google Glass and not realize that we are outsourcing our intelligence, then ultimately the collaboration is going to lead to social ills.
I think that, for the first group, which was basically made out of artists, the categorization emerged as an issue. So the first separation between artists and technologists feel like a sort of cage, and this problem presented in also in the other groups, especially regards to the fact that we are more and more talking about creatives, and we are not more talking about art, or maybe art has lost some characteristics, some disruptive characteristics. Another thing which was quite important for all the groups was the fact that the design process, the creation process, is not that recognized, but in funding, but in the communication moment. And with regards to funding, it's interesting the fact that we have talked about funds for art, but we didn't talk about funds for tech or science. So there was this, I get these testimonies from somebody who tried to, basically some disciplines in science are more paid or more highlighted with regards to others. So people tend to make a physical work fit in a biological one or whatever. And another point maybe which is interesting is the fact that expectations in some cases force too much the process in terms of timing and in terms of designing and preparatory phase. So these constraints inform the whole process and reduce the impact of the process and make the collaboration experience cool. And I think that's some interesting recommendations for the future. In the fact that there's a need for incubators, for places where this collaboration is possible, and for funding which comes from public and private partnerships to ensure the sustainability and the sustainability on the long term of the projects. Another thing that I think came also from that table is the fact that there's more need for facilitators, so mentors, curators, call them as you want, that do not come only from one field, but have a broader view on both fields or on a or have a multidisciplinary point of view. And the need for embed creative practices in education in order to grow new generation with an open attitude towards the collaboration, cross-disciplinary collaboration. And I think that's all.
So we also spoke about collaboration being something that is that happens most of the time naturally, not forced, but also quite unexpectedly. So it's sometimes people, by talking to other people, they might bring collaborations, and it's something that could happen over long term and in a quite open way, so not very structured, but also we talked about collaborations that happen between people that have known each other over time, so there's a trust developed and that leads to some successful projects. We did mention money, and sometimes artists that felt that are not equally paid to, for example, scientists or technologists, etc. We did mention time frames that could be different, working time frames that could be an issue. Also spaces sometimes could be an issue, for, especially if for many collaborative projects where it's not, they move beyond like a screen, so they are more sculptural, they need more space, or for example performance work as well. So then spaces could be problematic at this point. Then we talked about
also as other groups about failure and learning from failure and conflict as well, and not taking that in a kind of negative way, but also about this need of compromising in collaborations and sharing skills and expertise, but also having some ethical responsibility about like ownership and authorship of work. What else? Yeah, then in the second group we also mention about sometimes there are these cliches where and labels about artists, scientists, or technologists that at the end, sometimes in reality, people understand that they don't think so differently. They do work creatively in their own ways. And also another thing that we found very important was in collaboration was the public engagement and this idea of education as well, and the mention or the workshops or involving the audiences and the public in the process sometime. And finally, in the last group, we did talk about the need for dedicated funding structures, and of course the mentoring and training support and facilitating collaborations as well from institutions, from curators, from different people involved, and of course sharing successful stories and again learning there. And I don't know if I forgot anything from this table. Sorry if I did.
In the first session, our group was an other group. So we looked at physical access to space in terms of disability. That was one thing that came up. And also access technologically to things like this, for example. Let me see, I'm just trying to miss things out. That the cost of fast-changing technology was something else that got brought up. Large organisations find it difficult to put small organisations and individuals in their finance systems. Repeating, sorry. In the cross-disciplinary group, we looked at the word art and artist seems too general, which is actually quite a big problem. And also coding and technology are also referred to as art, which creates blurred outlines. The public is actually more educated on science rather than art, again another issue. And the science, when you put science on a research application, you get a lot more money. So that was one of the... somebody who was a filmmaker said that there were clearer roles within filmmaking than there were when you're an art and tech collaborator. So you had a producer, you have a director, and everybody knows what they're meant to do. And then we just thought we'd, for our last session, just go over the top 5 areas for change in art and tech collaboration. We want more opportunities for art and tech to meet, and this is by place. So right across Europe, depending on what your cultural heritage is. Looking at creative collaboration rather than art-tech collaborations, and including other disciplines such as social sciences and new hybrid emergent practices. We question the value of art and tech, we'll question how things are valued. So there's social and economical value, eliminating power struggles between artists and technologies, that seemed to come up quite a lot. And social economies, different narratives as values of collaborative, something or other. And there's quite a nice idea. Looking at, there's a lottery, I think it was either Nesta or TSB, a lottery of small funding. So it didn't really matter what project you came up with, you could submit for it and you could get some money. And this was actually we thought was quite a positive thing to suggest to the EU. Learning environments, bridging a gap between technology and art, and documentation of the way the process was really important for everybody. And then in terms of a nice story about art and tech collaboration, there was a techie, I'm sorry I've forgotten what your organisation is, but developing technology for museums. and it's a circular way of improving art. So basically artists contribute to the content management system of this museum that's been developed by a technologist. They constantly feed back to the technologist improves the system for the artist, and apparently it really works really well and everyone's really happy. So that was a positive outcome. I'm done.